So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining this event. This is the fourth, I think, in a series of landscape events focused on, we've looked at trees, peatlands and rivers. It's hedgerows today, and next month we'll be looking at coastlines. So I'll just do a bit of housekeeping. First of all, I'm Tim Gale. I'm the Zero Carbon Cumbria Partnership Manager. We have about an hour today, so it's going to be pretty rapid fire working through all of our brilliant presenters. So I'll do our best to keep us to time. As Nigel says, we will be recording this, which will be made available after the event. Please use the chat function to introduce yourself and ask questions along the way. There will be provision for 15 minutes or so of questions towards the end, but we'll go through the different presentations and take questions at the end, just due to the constraints of our time this afternoon. So I'll try and keep us to time, as I say, and I'll provide a polite 1-minute warning to our presenters if we're looking like we're running close to time. So welcome. I'll kick off with just a couple of minutes background on the Zero Carbon Cumbria partnership. And just give you a little bit of a picture about our ambition and how these events connect to that ambition of net zero by 2037. They're really important, these events that Nigel's brilliantly put together over the last few weeks and months in supporting and connecting the work of the Zero Carbon Cumbria partnership. The partnership's net zero ambition by 2037 is going to require really multi-dimensional and sort of multi-partner response to realise that ambition, and it will need to focus on both mitigation actions through emissions reduction and sequestration, but also adaptation measures, and recognise that climate change is already happening and is already impactful in the county. We know that land use change is going to play a really significant role in achieving the pathway to that net zero by 2037 ambition. And we know we need to act quickly. We're very familiar that climate change impacts are happening already in the county, particularly, of course, extreme weather events. So today we're going to hear from a range of organisations about some of the co-benefits of restoring our hedgerows, both for our climate and our nature. And these sessions, as I say, are very important in connecting into the work of the partnership, and the learning from them is directly supporting the work of one of our sector groups working on farming and land use. So I'll leave it there for now as a very quick introduction. As I say, we're going to be short on time, I think. So we'll move quickly on, and I'm going to hand over to Pippa and Sophia from the University of Leeds. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Tim. I'll just share my screen with you. Is that okay?
That's great. That looks good. Thank you.
Yeah. Great. Well, thanks very much to Nigel to inviting Sophia and myself to this webinar to tell you about some of the research that we've been doing at the University of Leeds in collaboration with 5 dairy farmers across Cumbria. And at these farms, we've been quantifying the amount of carbon that's stored in both the hedge biomass and the soils beneath them. And we've been using this data then to estimate the contribution that hedge planting can make to net zero targets. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that in this presentation. So there are a number of recent documents that have outlined planting goals for hedgerows to contribute to climate change mitigation. And one of those first reports was the Climate Change Committee and their land use report in 2018, when they outlined that we need to increase hedgerow length by about 40% in order for it to contribute to climate change and net zero targets. And that 40% increase represents about an additional well, just short of 200,000 kilometres of hedgerow, and that's about half the road length network in the UK. So it's a really ambitious amount of hedgerows to plant, and they had an interim target of a 20% increment by 2035. And then this represents half the length of hedgerows that have been lost between 1984 and 2007. And we do have plenty of scope to plant this amount of hedgerows, because it would represent only 11% of the field boundaries of all our arable and grassland fields that we have. A report came out in 2020 by Natural England, had an even bigger ambition of planting over 300,000 additional kilometres of hedgerows to basically contribute towards biodiversity and the favourable conservation status for hedgerows. So we can see there's a lot of ambition within the country to increase planting rates, and there's these hedgerows provide multiple benefits, and I'm sure we're going to hear from some of the other speakers about that. But this talk, we're just really going to focus on the climate change
that's what I was
they can make. So in order to understand the role that hedgerow planting can make to climate change mitigation, we need a lot more information on how much carbon is sequestered in hedge biomass and the soil beneath them. How much CO2 can we sequester by planting 40% more hedges, and what are our planting rates and how are we progressing to meeting these really ambitious targets. And by answering some of these questions, we'll also help the NFU in their report that they put out in 2019, where they outlined the ways in which agriculture could achieve net zero. And one of those was their pillar 2, which was really looking at how farmland could increase carbon storage. And obviously planting hedgerows would be one of the components of that pillar. So here we go. How are we getting on with regard to hedgerow planting? Where are we? So this graph shows you hedgerow planting since 2004 within agri-environment schemes in England. And what we can see over the period 2004 to 2022, we've planted just over 5,000 kilometres of hedgerow. And nearly all of those hedgerows have been planted around improved grassland and arable fields. But what we can see is that we can see a really big increase in the rate of planting, with actually the highest rates occurring in 2021 and 2022. And we can see it's not just hedgerow planting that's contributing to increasing hedgerow length, but restoration as well. The light blue shows gapping up, which is an option within agri-environment schemes. And we can see that gapping up of hedgerows represented about 30% of all hedgerow planting in the last 2 years, so it makes a significant contribution. And in 2022, we planted in England just under 1,800 kilometres of new hedgerows. And the average length of planting is about 700 metres, but 25% of all holdings planted over 800 metres of hedgerow, with an average length of just over 1.7 kilometres. We're mindful that this isn't the only route through which hedgerows are planted. Many farmers will pay for their own plants to be buy their own plants and plant hedgerows on their own funding. And there are other schemes, but in comparison to agri-environment schemes, they are a much smaller amount of planting is occurring through those schemes. So that's just, we'll come back to what this means in terms of planting that huge amount of hedgerows later on, when Sophia tells you a little bit about the work, how we've upscaled our results. So where did we carry out our research? So we worked, as I said, with these 5 farmers across the Eden Valley in Cumbria. And these farmers were participating in a supply chain private agri-environment scheme where they were encouraged to plant hedgerows as part of that scheme. And so across these farms, we found 4 age categories of hedgerows, and there was 8 hedgerows within each category. So we had the very recently planted hedgerows, which were between 2 and 4 year olds. We had hedgerows that had been planted 10 years ago. And on one farm, they planted a whole host of hedgerows 37 years ago. And then we had much older hedgerows, which we couldn't quantify their exact age, but they ranged from decades to hundreds of years old. And what we did is we compared the soil under these hedgerows with the soil in adjacent improved grasslands. And the adjacent fields were mainly improved grassland. They were grazed by dairy herds, or they were harvested for silage. They received fertilizer and slurry and were predominantly perennial ryegrass. The older hedgerows were managed very much by trimming every 1 to 2 years, and the hedgerows were dominated by hawthorn and blackthorn, which are the main species within UK hedgerows. And then there's a little bit of detail about the width and the height of these hedgerows. And in bold, you can see the amount of soil organic matter that's determined by the loss on ignition method. And what you can see within the grasslands, the organic matter content is about 8% in comparison to the hedgerows, where we can see in the older hedgerows, it's almost double at 15% soil organic matter. And about half of that is carbon. So we can see, this is in the top 10 centimetres of soil underneath these hedgerows, that you can see there's an increase in soil organic matter and therefore carbon stored in the soil beneath these hedgerows. So in this graph here, we're looking at the additional organic carbon that's stored in the top 50 centimetres beneath these hedgerows by age category. And so that's the additional carbon to the adjacent grasslands. And the grasslands stored about 125 tonnes of carbon in their top 50 centimetres. And so you can see that over time, the amount of carbon increases, showing that we're getting an additional uptake and storage of carbon into these soils with time until we reach a new equilibrium in the older soils. And this increase in carbon is about, and our average is 1%. But from the very young hedgerows, it's about 0.4% additional carbon, whereas in the older hedgerows, it's about 1.5%. And this equates to an additional 40 tonnes of carbon per hectare stored beneath the hedgerows on average. So we can see there's a considerable amount of carbon can be stored in the soil beneath our hedgerows as a result of planting hedgerows. And then I'm just going to pass over to Sophia now, who's going to tell you a little bit about the work we did 2 years later, because COVID came along, I'm afraid. So we had a little bit of a break from our research. And she's going to tell you a little bit about the carbon that's stored in the hedge biomass and then how we upscaled our results. So I'm just going to pass over to Sophia now.
Thank you, Pippa. So yes, after looking at how much carbon was found under the hedges, to get a fuller picture of the carbon sequestration potential of hedges, we needed to look at their biomass. So what we did is that we went back to the farms and we kindly asked the farmers if they would let us copy small sections of some of their hedges. And we had a professional hedge layer, Robert Hogarth, who was the person in charge of the groundwork for this. So we selected a few hedges from each of the age categories and then cut all the plants within a set volume of the hedge. So the plants were cut at the base of their stem and then they were passed through a wood chipper. The wood chip was all collected and it was weighed, and this way we could calculate how much carbon is found in a volume of hedge biomass. So this was done for each of the 4 age categories, and you can notice how, as Pippa said, the hedges here are slightly older to what Pippa was presenting because the work was carried on a couple years later, but they're the same hedges. So the results are what you would expect in a sense. So as a hedgerow grows from planting to maturity, its biomass increases. So older hedgerows just contain more carbon than newly planted ones. However, because for the first decade or so after planting, hedges are pretty much left to grow and they're only trimmed very slightly, if even, there is a very big increase in their biomass during this first 12 years after planting. Once a hedgerow instead reaches maturity and it starts to be trimmed very regularly, the biomass increases to a much smaller degree. It's key, however, to notice that the biomass does increase, even if not by a lot, and that is due to management. So between the 39-year-old and the old hedges in our study, there is an increase in carbon stock from 33 tons of carbon per hectare to 40 tons of carbon per hectare. And this is due to hedge management. So for example, hedge laying increases the density of the wood within a hedge. So despite having a very similar volume, older hedges just pack a lot more wood within the same volume. So using, if we use the difference in above ground biomass in the next slide, in the difference in above ground biomass between hedge ages, we can calculate what is the annual carbon sequestration rate that we can achieve in the first 40 years after planting a hedgerow. This sequestration rate is greatest, so it's around 2 tons of carbon per hectare per year in hedges that are younger than 12 years, because these are the hedges that have the largest increase in biomass. And instead, the carbon sequestration is lowest in 39-year-old hedgerows that have the smallest increase in biomass. So here the carbon sequestration rate is about 0.4 tons of carbon per year, so quite a lot lower. So what we have done at this point is to combine the results that were presented by Pippa, so looking at the soil organic carbon under hedges and the results that I just presented on the carbon that is in the biomass of the hedges. And we use them to estimate how much carbon we can effectively sequestrate via hedgerow planting throughout the country in England. So if we keep the current planting rate the same as it is now, which is around 1,800 kilometers per year, and we look at 40 years in the future, these newly planted hedgerows will have stored in their biomass and in the soil beneath them 2.3 megatons of CO2. These 2.3 megatons of CO2 would offset annually 1% of the CO2 emissions from agriculture for 40 years. And this is if we keep the planting rate as it is now. If instead we want to achieve the climate change committee goal and plant 193,000 kilometers of hedgerows to increase hedgerow length by 40%, this would mean planting 4 times as many hedges per year as we are now. So going to 7,400 kilometers of hedgerows per year. At that point, again, if we look 40 years into the future, these newly planted hedgerows will have stored 7.9 megatons of CO2 in their above ground biomass and in the soil beneath them. And these 7.9 megatons of CO2 over the course of 40 years would offset 3.5% of agricultural CO2 emissions every year. So to sum it up, in our research, focusing specifically on carbon offsetting, we have found that hedges store more carbon than the intensive adjacent grassland that they're planted around. And when we plant hedges, really the greatest potential of sequestering carbon resides in the first 12 years from planting, since planting a hedge. So planting hedges can be used as a tool for atmospheric CO2 sequestration, but in order to be effective, we need to increase substantially the current planting rates by about 4 times as much. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. That's it.
Thank you very much, Pippa and Sophia. That's yeah, mind-boggling amount of distance. I think it's about halfway to the moon, isn't it, in distance, the Committee on Climate Change, but we won't let that put us off. That's very encouraging that we've got such good evidence and good data coming out from the work you're doing, and I'm sure that can help support the plans that we want to put in place in Cumbria. So thank you very much indeed. Lots of questions coming through in the chat. Thank you for those. Keep those coming. We'll try and pick those up as we go along and pick them up at the end of the presentations. I'm going to hand over next to Pete Leeson from the Woodland Trust for a practical case study from Cumbria on hedge planting. So over to you, Pete.
Hi, I'm sorry I don't have any slides or photographs, so you're just going to have to imagine what's going on. Thanks very much for those numbers, because I think they really are very interesting. And I think there's two things about the carbon thing, is that we shouldn't lead our lives thinking about carbon sequestration under trees and hedges. If we do, we'll go mad, because it's only ever small percentages. We need to stop putting the stuff up there in the first place. So that's that. However, it does go somewhere on the carbon. It goes an awful long way on other things. And that's why I really, really love hedgerows. Biodiversity, massive boost to biodiversity, massive boost to moisture management. So I will talk a bit more about that in a few minutes. Moisture management, connectivity in habitats. So linking good habitats to each other, hedgerows are critical. Soil management, soil amelioration, fantastic as well. So there are some very key messaging around hedgerows, which we talk to farmers about a lot. The carbon is a small subset of that. So just that's my view, that's my take on it. I was on a fantastic farm this morning, Mark and Jenny Lee at Trepenna. They have completely changed their farm system, and they are an exemplar of how I am responding to farming at the moment and what I'm trying to advise and trying to get towards, which is a more regenerative farming picture. They've taken in the last decade a farm that was based around 200 to 250 Holstein cattle, high milk yields, but very demanding cows, lots of feed, lots of fertilizer, lots of energy and input into their system, and a lot of time and emotional and physical drain on the farming family doing that. They've moved that to a herd of about 150 cattle, all native breed mixed cattle that are now entirely fed from the grass on the farm. So they've reduced the intensity of their farming operation. At the same time, they've gone organic. They've taken their ryegrass lays that required, they were demanding of nutrients and fertilizer and food all the time to grow those ryegrasses, which cattle don't particularly like anyway. They're now doing multiple lays of chicories and clovers and mixed grasses and timothies and natural grasses and herbs, grazing their animals entirely on pasture. And they've revolutionized their farm business to one which includes cheese, butter production. I was there this morning. They've had their first run this morning at doing ice cream. So they're changing their business, they've repivoted. And the reason I'm talking about that is because what they've done is to reduce the field sizes massively from big fields to smaller fields using hedgerows, and then subdivided those to facilitate mob grazing by electric fencing. And the hedgerow has been a fantastic and fundamental part of that change. And Mark was telling me this morning, they put 5 kilometres of hedgerows back in to a farm. What they perceive as being the difference with those hedgerows, apart from breaking up big fields and facilitating grazing management, it leads to browse, increased browse. So the cattle, if you turn them into a field with trees and hedges and things like that, some will go for the grass in the middle, some will go for the grass around the edges of the field, many will go for the leaf litter that's on the hedges. It's a part of their diet. They're not designed to eat ryegrass the whole time. They're designed to have multiple inputs. They love the dry matter in the leaves, the moisture in the leaves, the protein in the leaves. So this adds to the browse, the food of the animals. It adds to the flavour of the cheese at the end of the day as well. So these hedgerows are a fundamental part of that system. I've spoken to many farmers like these guys who are changing to put hedgerows back, and field trees, and wood pastures is also part of this system as well. So putting trees back into fields. And Mark and Jenny are just now going onto that system as well, of putting trees back into fields. The thing is the same though, it's growing woody biomass back into a farm system, and hedgerows are woody biomass. They are part of the vegetation, just as anything else is in effect. So we're strong advocates of hedges. I've worked with lots of farmers who've done now multiple meters of hedgerows. One farmer in the north of the county said to me a few years ago, can you help me? I want to do this. I can't afford to do it. Can you come to some arrangement with me? And we said, every time you want to plant a hedge, let me know and we'll put some trees in the post to you. He's now done 5 kilometres of hedgerows right on the edge of the fell. He's got a sheep flock. His hedges, he reckons, now save him about 10% of his feeding requirements. He's added shelter back into his fields and shade in hot temperatures in the summer. We work a lot with natural flood management, so work with Rivers Trusts and Environment Agency, and we did a long-term study with Lancaster University looking at water management through hedgerows. Hedgerows planted at right angles to rivers. When the rivers flood, going through the hedgerow, it sifts out lots of material, but it slows the flow of water down significantly. Hedgerows also allow more percolation of moisture down into the ground, and they change the seasonality of the grasses around them as well. So hedgerows in the Pontbrent study in Wales showed that a good shelter belt, a good hedgerow, will increase the seasonality of the grasses either side of the hedge through moisture and through significant microclimate changes as well. In other words, a pasture with hedges in can have longer grazing periods than a pasture without. So if you've got pasture and fencing, there's no shade, no shelter, no soil changes, and lots of stress on grasses. Put a hedgerow in, you reduce the stress on the grass, you reduce transpiration rates, you increase the seasonality of the grasses. That's my summary. That's why I think hedges are fantastic. Push them. They are the gateway drug to other things. We have lots of farmers who planted hedgerows who then come back to me and say, we love that, Pete. Can we do some more? Can we plant some more trees? Can we do shelter belts? Can we do something else? Can we also do wildflowers as well? So this is the gateway drug. A hedge, people love doing it. It's easy, it's simple, it's replicable. You can teach a teenager to do it in 10 minutes. It's not difficult stuff. But we will have a legacy of hedge management that we've got to get round to. So if we're planting a whole load of hedges now, they will need to come into a system of management within the next 5 to 10 to 15 years. And that is something we all need to prepare for. I've done some hedge laying courses with people this year. We've been teaching people to lay hedges. That's great, but it's time consuming and labor intensive. It's a fantastic community event. We've done a community event in Cumbria, in Keswick this year, with Sustainable Keswick on hedge laying. But bear in mind, we will have to find some way of managing those hedges. And the best way on any farm is to make sure you've got a plan. So you can say, well, over a 10-year period or a 7-year period or a 15-year period, doesn't really matter. We will have a hedge plan where we lay some hedges, we might clip some other hedges, we might leave some to go big. And so all the way around the farm, we've got a manageable hedge plan where we can do a little hedgerow management, move on next year and do a bit more there and a bit more there, so that you're rotating your hedges all the way around the farm. That allows you over a landscape to have some big old trees with berries, nectar, pollen for birds, migratory birds coming through, at the same time as having some recently managed laid hedges as well. So in a landscape, what we want is this flux of young, medium age and old hedges to provide us with the best outcomes for conservation and management. I could go on, but I won't. I'll stop there. And if there's any questions later on.
Thanks, Pete. That's really a really great examples there, working with your colleagues on the farms there. Such great advocates for increasing our hedges. I think the co-benefits you set out there around flooding, reducing feed costs for stock. I also love the idea that hedges can improve the flavour of cheese. That gets my vote straight away. And the idea of community events around learning how to do hedge laying as well, something I've always fancied myself, so might be in touch, Pete. Thank you so much for that. We're going to move on now to Ellie Banks from CPRE Hampshire. Hedgerow Heroes, over to you, Ellie.
Thank you very much, Tim. I'll just share my screen. So hello everyone, thank you very much for having me on this talk today. My name is Ellie. I work for CPRE Hampshire. So CPRE Hampshire, or CPRE works across the country. So CPRE stands for Campaign to Protect Rural England. But the name has changed and it's now CPRE, and I work for the Hampshire branch, and we've been running a project for the last 2 years all about hedgerows, which I've been managing, so that's been great fun for me. So I would just like to chat to you a little bit about our project and how we've reached out to the community, and yeah, talk to you about hedgerows, one thing I really do love. So CPRE was set up about 100 years ago, and they have been working to protect the countryside in different ways. You may have heard CPRE more in the context of planning, because they tend to work with trying to reduce the number of planning applications that damage the countryside, but they've been working with hedgerows for the last 2 years, and that's where my focus has been. So I know we've talked about this a little bit today, but I thought I would add it into my slides just to make sure this was well understood. Hedgerows help us in many ways, and they help us because they've been here for so long. So although they are man-made, they are part of the landscape now. They've been here for a long time, thousands of years. So they are part of the ecosystem. They're part of the farming ecosystem. The UK is over 70% farmland. So from that, you can understand that hedgerows are a huge habitat, and therefore they play a huge role with our wildlife, but that have other benefits. So this is a really fantastic poster that I've stolen from the People's Trust for Endangered Species, which just shows all the benefits of hedgerows. So hedgerows are wonderful for wildlife, and it's something that you'll hear about a lot, I'm sure, or already have. And they provide a habitat or a shelter for such a range of our wildlife, ranging from raptors and birds to small mammals and insects. So yeah, they can't be said, there are nothing that can be said about them. They are fantastic, but they are great also for farmers, and they're also good for us, well, for people who aren't farmers, it's just me, but everyone. So they sequester carbon, as we've talked about, but yeah, and as Pete was saying, they're great for water management. So in times of drought, they keep water in the soil, but in times of flooding, they'll help the water go into the soil. But they're also good for things that farmers will want. So soil protection. If you've got lots of wind going across a farm fields, if you've got hedgerows there, they act as a wind barrier. But they also help improve our pollinator populations and help the animals on the fields, as Pete was also saying. So they have so many benefits. They help everyone, and there should be so many more of them. So this is the kind of thing that we should be seeing. We should be seeing this patchwork quilt that we know as this country. It's a quintessential English landscape, and we should be seeing big bushy hedges that have like a large volume that's so good for wildlife and good barriers. But unfortunately, more and more we're seeing this sort of American landscape, which has hardly any hedgerows, huge fields, and the hedgerows that we do have look really sad. They're really leggy, and they don't have the density that is needed for wildlife and as a barrier. And this is for a variety of reasons, but it's to do with the lack of management, lack of understanding and of the management that's required to keep hedgerows healthy, which is hedge laying, but also historically they've been ripped out because as farming machinery's got bigger, they've been seen as an inconvenience. So CPRE have been working for the last 2 years on hedgerow projects as a response to this information. And Hampshire have had 2 separate projects over the last 2 years, working to raise awareness of hedgerows in every way that we can to try and reverse this problem. There are also, I think, 7 other CPRE branches doing Hedgerow Heroes projects. So although Hampshire is quite far away from you, there may be other projects nearby. In Hampshire, we've worked in the west of the New Forest, and then in the centre, south coast of Hampshire in Fareham, as you can see those 2 circles. And we're also hoping to launch a third project that will be in the centre of Hampshire, in an area that's under a lot of developmental pressure and not in either the national parks and not in an AONB, so really needs our help. And through these projects, we've worked with a variety of different landowners, which has been really, really great. So in the first year, we worked on an estate, which was with tenant farmers and a large landowner. And then in the second year, we've been working with a council farm. So Hampshire County Council have 33 council farms in Hampshire. And we've been working with one of their tenant farmers, which has been really interesting and helpful for us and helpful for them. So I've enjoyed that a lot. And then we are hoping to work on a larger project next autumn, or the autumn coming. Which will be with a variety of landowners, so from private farmers to more Hampshire County farms, and working with parish councils and things like that. So the project has been extremely varied, and we've basically tried to work out how can we raise awareness with everyone, and how can we get in contact with everyone, engage everyone with this topic. So the first thing that we've done in our project that I want to talk about that we've done in our project is a community hedge fund. So this has been money that people can apply to have so projects. So this is schools, scouts, parish councils, anyone who has a project that is about hedgerows in Hampshire, that is either planting new hedgerows or laying hedgerows. We've been able to give people funding for that, which has been really fantastic. This year we've supported 12 different projects all across Hampshire. And I was working out this morning like how many people have been involved, and it's upwards of 700 people have been involved with this through us being able to give money out across the county, which has been really great. And then another element of the project has been going into schools. So I go into schools and give lessons all about hedgerows, going into a variety of age groups and complementing their curriculum to teach the children about hedgerows, because getting young people involved is obviously incredibly important and powerful. And we've also been able to provide plants and do hedgerow planting at 2 schools, and soon it will be 4 schools by the end of this month, which has been great fun. So having a legacy to those school groups who can watch that hedgerow grow and learn the species within the hedgerow and see new wildlife come to their playing fields. And another great thing that we've been doing, which Pete also mentioned, was hedge laying. So we talk about needing more hedgerows, and we talk about the fact that we don't have enough hedgerows because of lack of management. Therefore, we need to know how to manage hedgerows. And if we're going to plant a lot more, we're going to need a lot more people doing it. So hedge laying is absolutely essential. If you don't know what hedge laying is, I like to describe it like it's like bonsai. It's a way of controlling the hedgerow plants, which would naturally want to be trees, and bringing them back down to being a bush by cutting into the base, as you can see in the bottom right picture. You cut into the base 3/4 of the way through to leave a flexible tongue that you can bend your plant over, and this causes each of the plants the stress, basically. They respond to that with lots of growth at that point of cutting, which is basically getting thickness at the base. So if you do this on a cycle of maybe every 15, 20, 30 years, depending on the state of the hedges, you will maintain a thick bushy hedge, which is exactly what is needed for wildlife, but also to keep the hedge healthy and alive, and can ultimately lead to a hedgerow that can live for hundreds of years. So we've been running hedge laying training for local people, for farmers, people in conservation, people working on the land, but also people who are interested, which has been a really good success. And we've been doing this for the last 2 years, and have trained approximately 40 people, 50 people in hedge laying, which we think is a really important for the future of our hedgerows. But as well as this, we also decided this year that what we needed were more people who were actually working in the profession of hedge laying. So we have funded 3 traineeships for young people in hedge laying, which have been great. So they're not quite finished yet, but there are 3 young people working full-time with hedge layers as a result of this project, which is something I'm very proud of. And hopefully we'll have more people doing hedge laying as their job. So if you don't know already, the hedge layers actually are pretty much full on their bookings most winters, which is when hedge laying season is. So we do have hedge layers, but we need way more because they are at capacity already. So yeah, we think that's very valuable. And as well as that, we've also been doing hedge planting, which has been great to get a lot of people involved. We've had scouts groups, we've had school groups, we've had people coming for their like corporate volunteer days, but also just local volunteers who have been interested in the project. So, and we've got people to do lots of planting. This year, we've planted over 1 kilometre of hedgerow, which has been great. And we did similar last year as well. And it's been a fantastic way to get people involved and teach people whilst they're doing something practical. People can improve their mental health and connect with people in their area. So that's been a really valuable element to the project. And as well as those things, we've also been running online talks. So we've been hosting talks with Nigel Adams, who's a well-known hedge layer, but also with the People's Trust for Endangered Species, who have a hedgerow survey that they launched a few years ago. And so encouraging people to look at their hedgerows and understand what makes a hedgerow good and what makes a hedgerow in need of management or gapping up. Which has been really great because that has been a way for us to connect with people online. So people who may not want to come out or people outside of the county. I think for our Nigel Adams talk, we had 100 people. So we were really pleased about that. And as well as that, we've also been running some sort of day events. So we trained people in how to survey for butterflies and how to survey for bumblebees and how to survey for hazel dormice. Which has been a really lovely way to get people to understand why hedgerows are important and what for, and to start noticing. Just to, I know that's probably been a bit of a whirlwind of lots of slides of lots of different things we're doing, so I just thought I'd lay this out as a summary in the different project elements so you can see what we've been doing. So we've had the Community Hedge Fund, which I mentioned first, working with schools, both in lessons and planting at schools, and we've had talks, events, we've had hedge planting days for volunteers, hedge laying days, hedge laying training, hedge laying traineeships, and then finally at both our project sites we will have interpretation work so that there is a legacy to the project so that people can see what we've been doing well after that we've finished working in that area. So hopefully we'll have had a lot of impact in Hampshire, and I hope that has been interesting for you to hear about what we've been up to. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Ellie. That's a great presentation and really brilliant slides. Love the pictures of the hedge laying. It's a fantastic skill, that, isn't it? And I love the idea of the amount of engagement that you've carried out there is fantastic, particularly with young people. And yeah, really love the idea of young people having a positive view on what the hedge fund can be. And that's fantastic work. Thank you so much. So thank you for everyone for attending, particularly our presenters. That's been great to have those examples from both within Cumbria and outside as well. Particular thanks as well to Nigel for organising these great events. It's always my highlight of my week, these events. I love it. I love learning about all these different things that Nigel's putting on for us and all the training that is provided by this. Thank you very much.
Just on that, Tim, to highlight our next event coming up on the 28th of April, which is looking at climate solutions for Cumbrian landscapes on coastlines. So we'll be hearing about challenges such as flooding and erosion, and equally opportunities around things like offshore wind. So a variety of things along the very extensive Cumbrian coastline. Thank you.